Hello, my name is Sandra Gayer. I'm a soprano singer, broadcast presenter and braille music teacher, and a very warm welcome to episode 2 of our Journey Through Braille Music series. In 6 episodes is revealing what braille music is all about. And in this episode, exploring the basics, I'm welcoming back James Risdon. Now, if you've just joined us, James is a recorder player with a repertoire from the Middle Ages to the 21st century, much of which is learned from braille. He worked in the Music Advisory Service for the RNIB for 9 years. Hello, James.
Hello, Sandra.
So before we begin, could you summarise what we talked about last time and what we're going to discover in this episode?
Sure. So in the first episode, we talked a little bit about how braille music came into being and how it compares with literary braille. In this episode, we're going to look at a little bit more detail about how braille works for single-line instruments. So that's music for flute, violin, clarinet, and of course my own instrument, the recorder.
So we learned last time that braille is made up of cells containing 6 dots. But I think if you're listening, you might still be trying to imagine how that could be interpreted as music. Well, sighted musicians who are aware of the Braille code can read Braille using their eyes. However, us visually impaired musicians use our fingertips. Now, you've brought us along some music, James, and I'm wondering if you could describe exactly what you're reading and how that shows you what to play.
Of course. So the first thing to say, really, is that anyone who doesn't read Braille wouldn't be able to distinguish this piece of music that I've got in front of me from, say, a piece of Shakespeare or even a complex piece of computer coding. It's actually a piece by the 18th century composer Telemann, and it's on around 50 pages. It's bound and has a cover like any other book. But inside, as well as all of the introductory material, I've got the Braille music. So, as you've said, Braille has just 6 dots in each cell, which makes up 64 unique combinations. Now, clearly that's not enough to show everything in literary, music and scientific script, but each of these 64 dot patterns means something different depending on what we're reading.
That sounds like mental gymnastics. Can you give us an example?
Yeah, sure. So, for example, in ordinary text, the letter J, if it's preceded by a special numeral indicator, it would be read as 0. In Braille music, the same sign would represent a B. And, of course, there are some signs which are made up of 2 or 3 cells, one after the other. It sounds very complex, but actually it's a bit like learning a language, and eventually you learn to switch codes without really thinking consciously about what you're having to read and interpreting each symbol.
And tell us what the piece you played at the beginning looks like in Braille music.
So the piece that I have in front of me looks very similar. I have the title, the composer, and the publisher details all beautifully centred on the page. Then I have a note to say who transcribed the piece of music and a short note about the format and layout of the piece and any unusual signs that have been used. And in this case, everything is quite straightforward. So then I have the title of the piece, Fantasia number 5, followed by the key signature and time signature, which in this case is 9/8, and these are centred on the page to make them stand out so they're easy to find and locate. Then on the next line it says line 6 and bar 1, and this tells me that we're on line 6 of the print copy and bar 1.
And why does your copy show the print line number?
Good question, yes. So I don't need it particularly to learn my own part, but if, for example, I was teaching the piece to a sighted student, I could refer them to the exact location in the score, which is really handy, especially if there are no bar numbers.
Yes, and in rehearsals with conductors who are rather quick to refer to page 10 or rehearsal block G, it's very useful. And then I guess we have the treble clef.
Yes, so on the next line I've got the treble clef, though in Braille music they're really for information purposes only.
So far so good. But what about the differences between Braille music and print stave notation?
Okay, so the first important difference is that instead of dots placed on a 5-line stave as we have in print, Braille shows a 5th octave C in this instance, and this tells me that this is a C above middle C. So middle C on the piano is what we would call 4th octave C. And the bottom note on a violin, for example, would be third octave G.
And is that the same for music in the bass clef?
Absolutely. So one of the great things about Braille music is that the sign for each note is exactly the same, no matter what the pitch. So obviously I think there are many young pianists grappling to learn right and left hand signs and notes that move around the stave depending on which clef they're reading, who would really love this simplification.
And does every note have an octave sign then?
Thank goodness, no. That would be really difficult to read, although it might sound like it would be helpful. No, there are several rules which we don't really need to go into now, but basically, if the music moves stepwise, we don't need an octave sign. But if there are some rather large jumps, like in the piece I played at the beginning, we would need an octave sign. It's an area that you really have to be careful, though, because it's very easy to miss an octave sign and shoot off into the wrong octave.
And what about other features, which are different in Braille?
Well, print music is a sort of graphical illustration of sound. I think of it as a sort of time-pitch graph. It's possible to show things that happen simultaneously and in sequence, whereas Braille can't really show things that happen at the same time, such as a staccato dot on a note to show that we play it short. So everything has to be written one piece of information after another. I'm going to illustrate this with the opening of a piece for flute called Syrinx by Debussy. Now, it sounds very straightforward, but actually when I read the music out afterwards, you'll hear the kind of detail that is given in the Braille and how the various bits of information slot around the musical notes. So at the top of the score, I've got a performance indication, which here is très modéré. Then I've got a key signature of 5 flats and a time signature of 3/4. So on the next line, I've got a treble clef. Then I've got the MF sign for mezzo forte. Then I have a tenuto sign. Then I have an octave sign, the 5th octave sign, and only then have I got my first note, which is a B dotted quaver. Then I have a slur sign and a natural sign before the next note, an A. Then a slur, another natural sign before the next note, which is a B, then another tenuto sign before the A-flat dotted quaver. So you can see the kind of level of detail that goes around a note. And in fact, the last note, which is held for a very long time, has a pause and a breath mark afterwards, which, if you just listen to the piece, you may not pick up, but they're there in Braille.
Okay, well, we've seen some of the differences, but are there any features of Braille music which are familiar to people who are aware of print notation?
Yes, in fact there are, surprisingly actually. So for example, the sign to slur 2 notes together in Braille looks very much like the sign in print, and the sign to tie 2 notes of the same pitch together looks very similar. Where print notation uses a vertical line, the Braille uses a space to show bar lines, and while these are different signs, both signs are very clear to see.
And are there any areas of Braille music which are perhaps even easier than they are in print?
In fact, there are a couple of things I find really helpful. So Braille music uses repeat signs, probably more than print. So if there's a bar or several bars that are repeated, Braille has a sign for this so that you don't have to read all of that detail the second time. You know that everything is just exactly the same. It also shows, for example, where a beat is repeated or half a bar is repeated. And in quite complex music with lots of notes, that can be really helpful for the learning process. This not only saves space, but helps with learning music.
You mentioned learning music, and I just wondered how you would go about learning a piece like this.
Well, yeah, that really depends on the piece, I guess. Sometimes if I know the piece and how it sounds already, I'll have a process of reading through the music to check my ears haven't deceived me and, if you like, learn the detail that you can't always hear on a recording. And in fact, many recordings divert from the score, so if you really want to play what the composer's written, there's no substitute for having the score. If I'm learning a piece I've never heard before, I'll try to get a sense of how it sounds. I might whistle or hum it to myself while I'm reading, and usually I ignore most of the detail, such as slurs and accents and that kind of thing, until I've learnt the actual notes. Sometimes I actually even write out the music again, because I find this process really helps get it into my head.
I've only ever done that for exam practice. I cannot imagine doing that voluntarily. That does sound like an uphill situation. I mean, I would sight sing everything. So whether it's a piece of vocal music or piano music, I'd sing the right or left hand to myself and sort of teach it to myself by ear. Very comprehensive stuff. Now, I think it would be helpful if you could pull together the threads of this episode before you play us out.
Absolutely, yes. We've covered quite a bit of detail. Isn't it difficult to talk about Braille music without making it sound rather complex, like double Dutch? So I suppose what I would like people to take away is that Braille music has an inbuilt logic, if you like, which can cope with very simple and very complex music. And it can show everything that is in a print score so that you can compare this with a sighted colleague or friend using exactly the same language.
Thank you, James, for introducing us to the basics of Braille music and for sharing some of your strategies with us. In the next episode of our journey, we will be learning about vocal music.